I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to be an apologist. I never planned to get into apologetics. My book on apologetics I've talked about. I've done a video on how I got into that. And then lately I've sort of become, I guess, sort of a Protestant apologist of sorts, which I didn't really ever plan on doing. But before getting onto YouTube, I wasn't really into apologetics. I was mainly just doing more academic writing and then, of course, local church ministry. And then when I would do popular level writing, it'd be like devotional things, not really apologetics as much. And I believe in apologetics. I'm happy to do that. I want to do whatever's helpful. So I'm happy to, if things are helpful to people, do whatever works. But I've also been just reflecting on some of the downsides of apologetics, some of the dangers, and just some of the ways, it's that thing of just, you want to be so careful. I think my continual conviction that I've always had, but has deepened in recent years since I've been on YouTube, is that more practically oriented modes of theology, like apologetics or preaching, or even like ecumenical dialogue, really need to listen to scholarship, and scholarship needs to listen to practical modes of doing theology. Because scholarship can become kind of, I've spent a lot of time at academic conferences and working on other various things, and that world can become kind of cut off from real vivid concerns at the street level. But also, apologetics especially, it just seems like there's some real temptations and some real dangers. I was reflecting on C.S. Lewis's comment that he gave in a 1945 talk just earlier today. He said, "No doctrine of the faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as the one I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on oneself. As a result, when you go away from the debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar." Do you see what he's getting at there? It's a really good article to read the whole thing, or talk. He's saying, somehow apologetics can make it about you somehow. And I know what he's saying. He's also got a great poem called The Apologist's Evening Prayer. I'll read you a little bit of it. I wasn't going to, but it's so good. He starts off saying, "From all my lame defeats, and oh, much more. From all the victories that I seemed to score. From cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who wouldst give no sign, deliver me." I love the thought there that, you need to be saved from your victories more than your defeats. It's so true. There's something about doing apologetics, and I've already felt this and seen this and just reflected on it, that we need to be so careful with this, that can make it about you. It can make it about, and you can become defensive, you can stop listening, it can stop being about the truth. And you can find your identity in what you're defending, especially when we're doing like Protestant versus non-Protestant traditions. Boy, and there's something that I always want to be a part of Truth Unites as the ethos of this channel. I hope it's like this now. I think it is, but I always want it to stay like this, that it never becomes about, I don't know, how do I put this? It always has the larger goal of the truth, which is bigger than any defense of the truth. And that's sometimes people think of my channel title name, Truth Unites, as kind of wishy-washy, like, no, truth divides. And I actually think, I would say the unifying power of truth is, I would say the dividing power of truth is derivative of its unifying power. So yes, truth divides because it unifies. And I can give a defense of my channel title name, why I believe Truth Unites is a wonderful thing to say, and it's not wishy-washy, it's not compromise. And speaking about unity is totally appropriate, and irenicism is so good, and that's not at odds with robust defense of the faith and disagreeing and polemics at times, Excuse me. But I love this thought of coming back to this, like the truth doesn't need me, I don't need to defend it. It's going to be just fine on its own. And there's something about that that's so freeing when you're doing dialogues and you're nervous beforehand because you don't want to say something that could cause someone to stumble out there, something, remembering, who cares? It's not about me. If I misrepresent a Protestant view on something, or if I don't have a good answer to an atheistic objection in the moment or something, that's okay. God doesn't need me. There's a lot of other people who can give those answers. And while we have an impact, we want to be sensitive to the impact we're having. It's also so easy to overestimate our impact. And when we're doing that, then the negative, even I'll say toxic tendencies of apologetics can start to be more ever-present. And so I always want to do apologetics in a way that is able to listen and learn and receive, as well as give defense. And I don't think that's at odds with giving a defense of the truth and so forth. So all of that, thanks for your patience, is my setup to a great quote from St. Anselm that I want to share with you, because I come back to this quote again and again and again, and I thought others might find it useful. So here it is. If I, a trivial and inconsiderable fellow, should try to write something to add strength and support to the Christian faith, when there are so many holy and wise people all over the world, I would indeed be judged arrogant and could appear worthy of ridicule. For if other people were to see me well supplied with stakes and ropes and other things, by which we often secure and steady things that are wavering, working to strengthen Mount Olympus, so that no force would shake it or cause it to fall, it would be amazing if they could contain their laughter and derision. How much more so then, with that stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands, and struck and crushed the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, which has now become a great mountain that filled the whole earth. He's alluding to the book of Daniel there. If I should try to support it with my arguments and steady it as if it were wavering, so many holy and wise people who rejoice that they are secure upon its eternal steadfastness could grow angry with me, and attribute my efforts not to sober-minded diligence, but to frivolous self-aggrandizement. So if in this letter I have engaged in disputation concerning the steadfastness of our faith, it is not in order to strengthen that faith, but to satisfy the requests of the brethren who required this of me. About halfway through that quote, when I was reading it earlier, I was thinking, who's translated this? This is a very literalistic kind of translation. And then I realized it was me. I'm not joking. So, I was trying to go for literal, kind of very literal translations in my work, and I kind of forgot about that. But so I don't know. I love the thought of remembering, anytime you start to, what he says at the end there shows there is a role for apologetics. For example, if you love people, you want to give answers that will help them. So I believe in apologetics, but I love the thought of always and ever approaching apologetics in this spirit, that Mount Olympus doesn't need my stakes and ropes. In other words, my apologetics efforts are not the thing that's going to keep the faith. Rather, I'm just trying to help people. So I find that helpful. Let me say, for people who are wanting the main point of the video, now you can end it. But let me say a few more words about Anselm's epistemology. So this word is how we know. So let's say his theological epistemology, how we know God, and theology more generally. And this would be just a little academic, but I thought it might be of interest to some, and it's been on my mind because of my book. So some of this is drawn from my commentary on Anselm's Proslogion, but I got just last week in the mail this book, which is in the new series by Brill called Anselm Studies and Texts, and I did an essay in here on Anselm's epistemology. So I was reading back through it because it took like 6 years in the process to finally come out, and it was from a conference we were at in Boston in 2015. So 7 years, 6.5. And so I was reading back through it and remembering this conversation, and I thought this is very relevant to conversations happening today and to my own thought process about apologetics. Because one of the things in Anselm scholarship is, on the one hand, Anselm has this huge view of reason. He thinks of reason as enormously powerful, and that's evident in some passages. On the other hand, he seems to stricture the role of reason within faith in various ways. And so if you think of these words, rationalism and fideism, rationalism meaning we know God by reason, fideism meaning we know God by faith and revelation, people are saying Anselm contradicts himself because some of his statements sound like he's a staunch rationalist, and some of them sound like he's a radical fideist. So which is it? So, for example, he wrote 2 books, one called the Monologion, one called the Proslogion. And at the beginning of the monologion, so those are Greek words meaning speech to oneself and speech to another. And in the Latin word for monologion is sololoquium, which is why I called my blog Sololoquium until I renamed it Truth Unites recently. But at the beginning, and these are companion works. Throughout later in his career, he'll refer to them as sort of two parallel works. Well, in the monologion, chapter 1, he starts off saying, I want to argue by reason alone, sola ratione. And then in the proslogion, he says, I want to argue by faith seeking understanding. And there's many other passages there in proslogion 1 and elsewhere where he makes it sound like reason has no power apart from faith. So everyone's saying, well, which is it? Are you contradicting yourself here? And you can find people on the one hand who will say things like, I'll give some quotes here. These are not lightweight medievalists that I'm about to quote. One pretty significant scholar says Anselm's confidence in reason's power of interpretation is boundless. Another says Anselm is the most uncompromising rationalist which the church has ever produced. Anselm is not, he's picked on a lot. He's really misunderstood for his atonement. I'll do another video on Anselm's views of the atonement sometime. Those are often very much misunderstood. If you actually read his book, Why the God-Man, you'll find out he's in lockstep with like Irenaeus and recapitulation and these other Eastern ways of thinking and Athanasius, and that's a whole other thing I shouldn't get into. But his views on epistemology are also he's really caricatured and misunderstood a lot, and then you'll find people saying that he's a staunch rationalist. That's a powerful quote. The most uncompromising rationalist the church has ever produced, and then you'll find people. There was a Benedictine theologian named Anselm Stolz in the 1930s who argued that Anselm is a mystical theologian, and he's not even trying to prove that God exists. He's simply trying to understand the experiential knowledge of God and so forth. So it's really interesting, and what I'm trying to do in my scholarship is basically cut the tension, because I believe that there's an answer to that kind of dilemma. And basically, for people interested in this, what I'm arguing is, when Anselm says by reason alone, these statements that sound very rationalistic, or in other books, in the Cur Deus Homo, he'll say, I want to argue remoto Christo. So Christ having been set aside, as if the incarnation hasn't happened, I'm going to reason. That these are not, this doesn't mean reason apart from faith. It's a statement of method, not a statement of epistemology. So, when we hear that phrase sola ratione, the word sola implies the exclusion of a possible conjunction. It sounds like, just like sola fide means faith alone, that is not faith plus works. And we tend to think sola ratione means, okay, reason alone, i.e. not reason plus faith, because that's our context. But in Anselm's context, the natural contrast would have been not faith versus reason, but reason versus authority. And so I'm trying to draw attention to his influences, Boethius, for example, the 6th century philosopher, and then I kind of trace out this reason versus faith construct all the way up into other thinkers right before Anselm in the 11th century, like Peter Damian and Berengar and others. Now that would have been natural for Anselm. So in other words, when Anselm says sola ratione, I want to argue by reason alone, he's not saying I'm going to not have fides qua, the faith by which we believe, a heart of trust in God. He's saying I'm not going to appeal to the fides quae, the faith which is believed. And I think that's clear. I mean, as much as there's so much back and forth on this in the scholarship, I think it's very clear because several things. One is that Anselm explicitly and repeatedly defines sola ratione as that. In Eadmer's biography of Anselm, Eadmer was the first biographer of Anselm. In the prologue of the Monologion, he'll say, here's the kind of book I'm trying to write. I'm having theological discussions with the other monks in the monastery at Bec, and they came to me and asked me to write a book, Sola Ratione, and he defines that as i.e. not appealing to authority. And there's many other passages like that. And again, it just makes much more sense in Anselm's context, where he's into the high Middle Ages, but he's really the kind of reigning ways of doing theology would have been that he would have been reacting against are more the early medieval ways of thinking. So, in the early medieval era, honestly, the way people did theology, I'll state it a little too strongly for effect, but basically, it's you compile your quotes. The standard theological texts were florilegia, which are just collections of quotes, and then later glosses, which are quotes with commentary added on, and it's whoever can compile more quotes from Augustine and Scripture, and they win the debate. That's putting it too strong, but that's really how theology was done in the early medieval era. It's heavily focused on compiling and exegeting texts, and so Anselm's arguing by reason alone, and it's very controversial. It's a very new way of doing theology. It makes his teacher, Lanfranc, very nervous when Anselm sends him when he first finishes the Monologion and sends it to Lanfranc, and Lanfranc is basically kind of critiquing, and it damaged their relationship because Lanfranc is critiquing him and saying, not the content is innovative. The content is thoroughly Augustinian, but he's saying the method. He's saying you're not citing enough authorities. You don't have enough Scripture and Augustine quoted in the book. And so in Anselm's day, that way of doing theology by reason alone was so new. But it's just easy to read him in light of the later developments and Thomas Aquinas and the kind of scholastic tradition that follows Anselm. So anyway, all of that is to say that Anselm is not excluding faith. He is not a rationalist. He's completely misunderstood along those lines. And I'll just give a few quotes to demonstrate that. I think the clearest passages to this effect are in his letter on the incarnation of the Word, where he just lays out his epistemology, and he explains that the absolute necessity of faith. And people like Karl Barth love Anselm because they love to, kind of construct their own approach to questions of religious epistemology, drawing from these quotes in this text, but in Proslogion and others. And he's basically saying he has a very high view of experience. Anselm is a very experiential theologian, and he's basically saying faith is absolutely necessary because faith flows, because understanding flows from experience, and faith must precede experience. So he's got this, one of the clearest passages I found is he's basically saying you cannot know God apart from not only faith, but the cleansing of the Holy Spirit and childlike obedience and inward cleansing and so forth. And then he says, he who will not believe will not understand, for he who will not believe will not experience, and one who will not experience will not know. For as much as experiencing a thing is superior to hearing about it, so much does the knowledge of someone who experiences surpass the understanding of someone who experiences. So one of the questions that comes up here is, okay, because Anselm was this is one of like 9 quotes I go through, but Anselm was very clear, there is absolutely no knowledge of God whatsoever apart from faith. You have to have faith. And so the question comes up then what is even the point of doing apologetics? Is there any role for apologetics? For someone who has an Anselmian approach to the knowledge of God, it's always faith-seeking understanding. If reason operates within the boundaries of faith, what could its relevance be to those who don't have any faith? And why even argue with people? What's good is it going to do? And I think that's where some of the Barthian interpreters, I think, go too far, because Anselm does think we can we can say things that are helpful and meaningful to those who don't have faith. And the metaphor I've come up with for this is like, if you imagine, basically there's 2 different kinds of knowledge. There's the knowledge that is within faith and the knowledge outside of faith. If you've heard of Jonathan Edwards' metaphor of tasting the honey versus having being told that honey is sweet, this would be this experiential knowledge, and then this more theoretical knowledge. So the metaphor I like to use is, imagine a husband and wife are married, and they're trying to explain that their marriage is a happy one to someone else. Maybe in court for some reason they need to defend that their marriage is healthy. They could do that. They could theoretically, bring forth evidence of here's how many date nights we go on, here's what we do on our anniversary, here's testimony from our neighbor who acknowledges that we get along well, or you could do that. It's not like you can't explain it, but the knowledge that would be yielded by that would be qualitatively different than the knowledge they themselves know by actually being in love. So that's like the knowledge of faith. You can't just hand off the knowledge of faith to somebody, but you can still make a defense. You can still explain it, even if it will result in a qualitatively inferior kind of knowledge. It's like until you've tasted the honey, you can still try to explain, well, have you tasted this? It tastes a little bit like that. You can say something, but what emerges from all of that is just how modest and limited Anselm's view of the power of reason to convince others is. And that's something I find really powerful. To remember that everything we do, when we are defending the Christian faith to others, at the end of the day, God the Holy Spirit can use that, but we cannot argue someone into the knowledge of God. Ultimately, that will be a work of God's Spirit drawing them. And so that's why prayer is so important in all that we do. We have to pray that the Lord would use our works, our words, and everything that we do in the process of where someone is at and where they're coming from. And I pray that way about my videos, There's no way to just have a positive impact just by saying the right things. Just like, anyway, I'm going on too long. Let me finish by encouraging people to read Anselm more. I find Anselm a neglected theologian. I think he's just absolutely unique and interesting in so many ways. I'll do something else on his Doctrine of Atonement. Let me just say 3 personal benefits, each real quick, for why I love Anselm. Why I just would love for more people to engage with him. And then if you're looking for a good book to read, well, I'll put this, I'm sorry it's so expensive. I'll put this in the video description for anybody who wants this. It's a commentary on the Proslogion. It could be helpful to walk you through the Proslogion. It's an academic book, but my main encouragement would be to read Anselm's Proslogion itself. It's a great starting point. 26 chapters, some of the chapters are one sentence. So it's extremely brief. You could read it in one sitting, and yet I'm convinced Anselm's Proslogion is one of the finest theological texts ever written, and it is endlessly profound. So 3 things I love about Anselm. One is just the whole aroma and atmosphere of his theology. I'll never forget the time in my life I first realized how interesting ideas could be was reading Anselm's ontological argument. But it wasn't just the argument, the bizarre, just thinking, really, can you really prove God from the idea of God in the mind, and yet not being able to disprove the argument based upon some flaw in the logic. I'm like, I can't see a chink in the armor here in terms of the syllogism, but surely you can't just go from the idea of God in here to God actually out there. And wrestling with that was the first time in my life I discovered how interesting ideas can be, how fun it can be to work through something at an intellectual level. But it's not just the argument, it's the whole prayerful aroma. The whole book is a prayer styled after Augustine's Confessions, and it's addressed to God. He doesn't even get to that argument until after this lengthy prayer, the longest chapter in the Proslogion 1, this lengthy prayer. And something about his prayerful approach to theology. In the context of my research, I had to read a bunch of the French and German texts on the Proslogion that aren't translated, because it's amazing how much the English language scholarship just doesn't engage with that at all. And some of the major texts on the Proslogion are in French and German, and even I didn't read the ones in Portuguese. But there's also the other languages too. But one of the French scholars on the Proslogion says, this is more than a book about the existence of God. He says, this draws us up into the secret, silent desire of humanity. That's how I feel about Anselm. It's almost got this existentialist type feel. It's like it shows the correlation between the existence of God and the deepest, most penetrating longings of the human heart. A second thing I've loved is just how the centrality of God in Anselm's thinking. It's a powerful rebuke to us in the modern West, because our tendency is to start with human thoughts and human curiosities and then build upward to God. but Anselm's whole approach is to start with God. So Anselm's problem was, how can God ever have mercy? Whereas our problem tends to be, how can God ever judge? And those are, just two fundamentally different starting points for doing theology, and I find Anselm's approach such a helpful corrective to kind of modern instincts. And then the last thing I'll mention is just his doctrine of friendship. This is when I've taught classes on Anselm, I take the students through his prayers to the saints and then his letters to other monks. And you can find these letters where his doctrine of friendship is like amazing. He thinks that two souls can be spiritually united through love for one another, to the point where it almost sounds like perichoresis, the idea of the mutual interpenetrating and indwelling, like among the persons of the Godhead. He's using language like that for his love for these other monks. In the scholarship, there's a discussion of whether he had homosexual desires for these other monks, and I don't think that he did. I think that's a reflection on our shallowness in the modern era, that we don't understand the depth of friendship that is possible, the depth of love that is possible without sexualizing it in some way. But Anselm was just, I don't know, his view of friendship was so high, and that's one of those things in the modern world that I don't think we're as aware of, is how low our view of friendship is. In the ancient world, friendship was a higher love, generally, than romantic love. But in the modern world, we've inverted that. We've lost this idea of rich and deep friendship, and Anselm had that. And in his own life, he wasn't just known as a theologian. Anselm was known for his spiritual counsel, for his prayers, for his friendship. And so I think that's another aspect of his life that just is really worth engaging and so profoundly helpful and reorienting for us in the modern era. So I encourage people to read more Anselm, and I encourage all of us to think about how his perspective on the knowledge of God and how we are to see the object as like a mountain and ourselves as tiny in relation to it can help us all think about apologetics. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. God bless you.